Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'll be your host this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. And together, we're going to be exploring what's on our minds and hopefully figuring out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, this morning, for the first time in Seattle for the year, it was cold and wet, and it actually felt like fall. We had a very global warming summer in Seattle this year with warm temperatures that lasted far longer in the year. But now it's definitely football weather. How are things looking on your end?
It's a beautiful fall day here. I have no complaints. I was going to ask you, though, about the wildfires that are encroaching in Washington, but it sounds like maybe that's not affecting you directly.
Well, everyone complains about the rain in Seattle, but one of the advantages of rain is that it will wash the air clean of smoke. So, yes, we had bad smoke for a week, but now that it's started to rain again, it's crystal clear. So thank you for the rain clouds.
And speaking of rain clouds...
Speaking of rain clouds, let's turn to something other that's overhead, which is the conflict in Ukraine. I asked you about something that's been puzzling me about that, which is, for context, you and I grew up during the Cold War, and we heard about this Russian military juggernaut. I read one or two Tom Clancy novels that were based on the premise that Russia had this supreme military machine that if it ever was put into action, it would just be a terrifying force to behold. And yet the Ukraine conflict has played out in very different terms, with the Russian military getting quickly bogged down and by all accounts just not performing very well at all. So the question I put to you came in two parts. And the first is, what happened to the Russian military? Was it never the well-oiled machine that we heard about, or has it gone through changes more recently? And then second part of the question, is this good news or bad news? Is Russia more or less dangerous if its conventional forces are kind of a mess? So I'm looking forward to hearing what you learned.
Yeah, and let me go off script first at the beginning, because as I heard you rephrasing the question, it occurred to me you keep referring to the Russian military, but back in the Cold War days, it was truly the Soviet military, which included Ukraine.
True.
And we've seen how fiercely the Ukrainians are fighting for their own independence right now. So yeah. I guess we shouldn't be surprised that the Soviet military was a juggernaut, because it included many other countries besides Russia, including countries that have demonstrated their courage in the field, like Ukraine.
Yeah, fair point.
But generally speaking, I feel like this is a tricky question to answer, your question this time. And that's because almost all our prior podcast subjects I would describe as static situations. But this one is about a hot war whose facts on the ground change every day. So in developing my answer, I had to check out the news headlines daily to make sure my understanding of the situation was still accurate.
Yeah.
You're asking two discrete questions here, so I want to take them one at a time. The question of why the Russian military is performing so poorly in Ukraine is the easier of the two. So let's start there. Writing for a national security blog in June, Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee stated a maxim about military planning. Quote, "Force structure reveals a great deal about a military and its assumptions of what wars it plans to fight and how it plans to fight them." End quote. The Russians sent a quick strike force into Ukraine expecting to secure vast swaths of territory relatively painlessly, including major cities like Kyiv. Ahead of the invasion, they didn't beef up their forces above peacetime staffing levels. They brought the wrong troops to Ukraine. According to Kaufman and Lee, Russian formations, quote, were heavily weighted towards artillery, armor, support, and enablers rather than motorized rifle infantry and the availability of dismounted units. The effect on Russia's ability to operate in urban terrain, support armor with dismounted infantry, and control terrain was profound, end quote. In short, they didn't plan for protracted fighting in cities and for holding the ground they seized from a determined Ukrainian military defending its homeland. If you're like me, you're probably wondering why Moscow would make such huge and seemingly dumb mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
American and European foreign policy wonks are virtually unanimous in their criticism of Russia's missteps in Ukraine, from their lack of preparation for a longer conflict to their terrible strategic planning and force deployment. But there's a technical aspect to this that I found particularly intriguing, and it has to do with the way the Russian military was redesigned at the end of the Cold War. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia abandoned its huge conscript-heavy army in favor of a leaner standing force. Up to that time, the Russian military had been comprised of two types of soldiers: the conscripts, drafted civilians forced to serve fixed terms, and then the contract servicemen, the professionals who enlisted voluntarily and served for years. In the period between 2008 and 2012, Russia phased out its twice-yearly 12-month mandatory draft of men aged 18 to 27, so that its army would consist of exclusively professional soldiers. Its thinking was that a smaller but better trained army could manage whatever conflicts arose in the future. Russia was not alone in thinking this way. The U.S. did the same thing after the Vietnam War, with the one exception being that we employ the Powell Doctrine. I don't know if you remember that, Mark. It's named after Colin Powell around the time of the Gulf War. The doctrine emerged that we're only going to engage in war when we have overwhelming force plus public support.
And different strategies have been deployed to engage that public support, some of which, around weapons of mass destruction may have been a little deceptive.
Outright lying. Good point. Some of Russia's reforms were walked back beginning in 2013 when Russian military planners began to think its military was too small to fight a regional or large-scale conflict against a formidable opponent. They moved from no draft at all to a partial mobilization model in which conscripts supplemented the regular soldiers. That way, it was thought, they'd retain the flexibility to generate significant numbers of high-readiness combat troops on short notice. But overall staffing and costs were still far lower than in the Soviet era, and nobody knew how this trimmed-down army, with a much smaller infantry rounded out by conscripts lacking proper training and technical skills, would perform in a large-scale conflict. Kaufman and Lee articulated the challenge this way. I'm quoting again. The Russian military is well suited to short, high-intensity campaigns defined by a heavy use of artillery. By contrast, it is poorly designed for a sustained occupation or a grinding war of attrition, which would require a large share of Russia's ground forces, which is exactly the conflict it has found itself in. End quote. Russia's defense establishment expected that if its forces ever ended up in the kind of slog in which it currently finds itself in Ukraine, its political leaders would authorize a massive mobilization to provide the overwhelming force required to succeed. But that didn't happen. Vladimir Putin's special operation, the euphemism he used to describe a major land war begun in late February against the second largest country in Europe, did not initially include any mobilization of conscripts. The question of why that happened has multiple answers, and anyone who's been reading or watching the news this year already knows some of them. Putin clearly thought Ukraine would offer little resistance. He probably had an inflated sense of his military's capabilities. The Russian military, for its part, may have been dishonest about what it could do in Ukraine, which is especially plausible in a totalitarian system where the wrong answer can mean jail or worse.
Right.
Alternatively, Putin may not have listened to his military advisors because they didn't tell him what he wanted to hear. The truth is probably all of the above. After having easily achieved his tactical goals during prior incursions into Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, Putin made a crucial political assumption that Ukraine would surrender quickly and that he could achieve regime change in Kyiv without having to organize or plan for a major war. As a result, the Russian military deployed understaffed battalions of soldiers sitting in endless columns of armored vehicles, but without enough infantry soldiers to dismount and fight on the ground. Kaufman and Lee described it as tons of metal, little manpower. Though it has about 1 million active duty troops, only about 200,000 took part in the initial invasion of Ukraine. That's far too small a force to seize and occupy a country of 44 million people. Given all this, it's no surprise that Putin relied heavily on local militias and private paramilitary forces in areas of Ukraine sympathetic to Russia. It's also no wonder that he belatedly decided to call up 300,000 military reservists to shore up the war effort. U.S. intelligence characterized the mobilization as a last resort that Putin had been very reluctant to take earlier, fearing it might hamper domestic support of the war. And boy, was he right about that.
Yeah.
The badly botched mobilization appears to have done exactly that. CBS News reported that, quote, the blind, elderly, and others incapable of fighting were among those who received summons to fight, end quote. The New York Times echoed that with a front-page story this week about how ill-prepared the call-ups are. And I quote again, in theory, the draft was of men in the reserves with military skills that needed refreshing, but in practice it pulled in virtually anybody, end quote. Many of those reporting for duty were issued rusty old rifles and have faced shortages of basics like uniforms, food, and protective gear. In addition, with so many of its best troops already in Ukraine, there's an open question of whether there are enough training officers left behind in Russia to train all the new recruits.
Yeah, I'm just imagining how that must feel to be a conscript right now in Russia, where you're handed, like you say, a rusty gun and sent into an arena with little to no training and not even the promise of food once you get there. Like the amount of fear and despair and rage that must inspire.
Right.
I cannot conceive what it would be like to be in that situation.
Yeah, we can't get into their heads for sure, but I'm going to tell you about their actions since this mobilization. So you're anticipating where I'm going with this. Rather than triggering a surge of patriotism in Russia, the conscription effort did the opposite. As Elliot Cohen wrote in The Atlantic, quote, Russia's military mobilization is deeply unpopular, as more Russian men flee the country than can be inducted into an army that cannot equip them, cannot train them, and cannot lead them, end quote. All indications are that Russians don't want to fight in this war, leading to a daily mass exodus of tens of thousands of draft-age men fleeing Russia for neighboring countries any way they can get there, by plane, car, bicycle, and even on foot. 2 Russian men fled by boat to a remote Alaskan island in the Bering Sea, where they now seek asylum. Many who left did so as fast as they could, with whatever belongings and cash they could carry, leaving their homes, jobs, and families behind. We can intuit that these men know how poorly the war is going. And while they may have tacitly accepted the invasion of Ukraine when it didn't touch their lives, now that it has, they're voting against it with their feet.
Yeah.
Putin, realizing how unpopular the mobilization had become, called a halt to it last week, saying that he didn't need 300,000 men after all, that 220,000 would be enough.
And you can only imagine the long-term cost that this is going to assess on Putin's Russia, because the people who are going to be most successful in fleeing the country are the people probably who have the sort of marketable skills that will entice other countries to accept them in.
Right.
So the sort of men that you would want to keep around in Russia to build a bigger and better version of the country are the ones who are most likely to be fleeing right now.
Right. But even unskilled men, I think, would be sorely tempted never to come back to Russia once they get to a place like Finland, you
Right.
know, that's a much more liberal society and gives them many more opportunities and doesn't repress them for political speech.
Yeah.
So, yeah, your point is well taken. It's really impossible for us to know how many men have fled Russia since the conscription order. But Russia's one remaining independent newspaper, Novaya Gazeta, cited an estimate by security services that about 261,000 military-aged men left the country in just the first 4 days after the call-up was announced.
Holy cow.
Judging from the long lines at border crossings since then, the number of escapees is much higher than that. Earlier this month, Kazakhstan reported that it alone received 200,000 Russian arrivals since the mobilization announcement. Apparently, that's because Russians can enter Kazakhstan without a passport. Some neighboring countries like Finland were forced to close their borders to Russian tourists. It seems obvious that Russia is losing many times the number of fighting men they're calling up. And on the other side, Ukraine already mobilized virtually every combat-aged male in the country, and with continuing Western military support that shows no signs of diminishing, it appears well positioned to sustain its resistance. Whether Russia has lost the 65,000 troops Ukraine claims to have killed or otherwise removed from the battlefield, or the lower estimates made by Western intelligence agencies, it's nonetheless clear that Russia has suffered huge casualties in this war, and an even larger blow to its national pride and conception of itself as a military superpower. Of course, that didn't stop Putin from annexing 4 eastern and southern Ukrainian provinces last month, and claiming in speeches that Russia would defend them by any means necessary, invoking the specter of nuclear weapons. And I'll say more about that shortly. But with Ukrainian offensives slowly reclaiming lost ground, it's growing increasingly doubtful that Russia can hold on to all the territory it seized in the early months of the war. In an assessment last month, the Institute for the Study of War wrote, quote, "Rushing thousands of untrained and unmotivated Russian men to the front will not meaningfully increase Russian combat power." End quote. The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, didn't mince words, advising the new recruits to, quote, "Get a tattoo with your name and surname so that we know how to find your relatives when you are killed." End quote.
Ouch.
To date, Russia's war in Ukraine has been an embarrassing debacle, evidenced by the hulks of burned-out tanks lost because there wasn't enough dismounted infantry to defend them, and the abandoned vehicles left everywhere because the poorly trained troops didn't know to destroy them before retreating. The colossal scale of this failure cannot be overstated. It resides at the nexus of hubris and incompetence. It will be studied at West Point and in other military schools the world over for decades to come, and it may yet be the undoing of the Putin regime in Russia. Your second question, Mark, about whether the Russian military's dismal performance in Ukraine makes Putin's Russia more or less of a threat on the world stage, is a much tougher one to answer. On the one hand, you might think an inept military that can't even defeat a minor neighboring country like Ukraine is nothing for the United States, NATO, or the rest of the world to be afraid of. Russia is a sclerotic petrostate in a world that's moving away from fossil fuels. It's very much the regional power President Obama called it after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, quote, "not out of strength, but out of weakness," end quote. That's why I think it's notable that President Biden seems so concerned about Russia. In remarks made at a private fundraiser on October 6th, the night before you asked me this question, Biden said that Putin's recent threat to use all available means to secure the 4 Ukrainian provinces annexed by Russia last month poses the greatest nuclear threat to the world in the last 6 decades. I'm going to quote the president now. "For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a direct threat to the use of nuclear weapons if in fact things continue down the path they've been going." End quote. Biden maintained that Putin was, quote, not joking when he talks about potential use of tactical nuclear weapons or biological or chemical weapons, because his military is significantly underperforming, end quote. He told the donors his administration was, quote, trying to figure out what is Putin's off-ramp. Where does he find a way out where he does not lose face or lose significant power in Russia, end quote. Aides later clarified that Biden's remarks were not based on any new intelligence, but instead reflected the president's assessment of what Putin might be capable of, that he might resort to what the Washington Post described as increasingly drastic measures if the Ukraine war continues to go so poorly for his country. Now, the Post reported that the U.S. was engaged in direct discussions with Russia about the repercussions of using such weapons, quoting a senior State Department official as saying, quote, we have been doing contingency planning for a wide range of scenarios throughout the conflict, but have not seen reason to adjust our strategic nuclear posture, end quote. Some Western analysts interpret Putin's remarks as a signal to the U.S. and NATO that Ukraine's recent battlefield successes must not progress to the point where the Kremlin feels cornered into using weapons of mass destruction. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is reconsidering whether it makes sense to offer Putin a face-saving way out of his predicament. The Prime Minister of Finland, Sanna Marin, asked by a reporter about potential off-ramps for Putin, said simply, for Russia to leave Ukraine. Is this an existential crisis for Putin? Maybe. He doesn't have a strong hand to play and may ultimately need to cut his losses and settle on the least painful losing scenario, which he will surely spin as victory. Elliot Cohen, writing in The Atlantic about the cascading consequences arising from the destruction of a bridge separating Russia and Crimea on October 8th, points out that public opinion in Russia is currently in a state of, quote, boiling discontent with the military, the conduct of this war, the absurd insistence that it is not a war but a special technical operation, the incompetent mobilization, and by implication, Putin himself. Paranoid by professional training and personal inclination, Putin must now look within as much as he looks without. End quote.
Yeah, it's actually illegal, I understand, to call this special military operation a war in Russia. You can go to jail simply for calling a war.
That's correct.
Which speaks to the level of self-deception that Putin aspires to within his society.
Yes. Senior military officials, political figures, and other pro-war commentators in Russia have begun to scapegoat the architects of the botched operation, including Russia's defense minister, and that criticism will inevitably land on Putin's desk. Any threat to use nuclear weapons must be taken seriously, especially when it comes from the country that has more of them than any other nation on Earth. Russia's recent illegal annexation of 18% of the landmass of Ukraine puts it in position to treat any attack on that territory as an attack on Russia itself. But most experienced Russia analysts believe the nuclear threat is overstated. Although Russia currently deploys about 1,500 nukes, they are of the long-range strategic variety, the much more powerful kind mounted on ballistic missiles meant to take out major cities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. Russia does have a large stash of lower-yield tactical nuclear weapons designed for use on the battlefield, but they are all in storage and would need to be removed from their bunkers, loaded on trucks, and combined with a delivery system like a missile before they could be launched. NATO has satellite eyes on that situation 24/7, and thankfully there's no evidence from the intelligence community that Putin is preparing to use nukes of any kind. As one military analyst told Reuters, quote, he is bluffing right now. But what will happen in a week or month from now is difficult to say when he understands the war is lost, end quote.
Yeah, I'm really flashing to North Korea on this with all of their nuclear saber rattling. and discussions around, yes, you want to shut down North Korea's aspirations, you want to shut down its nuclear program, but if you bring the regime there to the point where it feels like it's lost the game, what might its final play be? And that final play might be a screw you all and launch the missile scenario. So it seems like we've now got both North Korea and Russia in terms of stopping them from being militarily expansionist, but also worrying about what they might do if you succeed.
Yeah, boy, that's a scary comparison you make to North Korea, because with regard to North Korea, I think that Looney Tune at least is kind of under the control of the Chinese president, who seems rational even though he's running a totalitarian dictatorship. Whereas Putin, I don't think has anybody over his shoulder, you know?
Yeah.
So if he's going to go the way of the North Korean dictator, that would spell true peril for the entire world.
I should clarify that I don't think that he's as crazy as the ruler of North Korea, because very few people are. But I do think that one of the essential elements of Putin's view about the world is that he should be on top of that world and that no one should dictate anything to him because he dictates to others. And so if he's forced to swallow humble pie, I really don't know how he's going to stomach that.
Yeah. And that's Russia is a superpower second to none is another part of his theology, and which has clearly been disproved in this year.
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of his supporters in Russia are probably supporters because they see him as someone who's reclaiming the pride of the Russian state.
Agreed.
Which had such a bigger footprint within the Soviet space, similar in a way to the forces that brought Hitler to power, and that Germany was diminished, and he promised that he was going to reconstruct the German Empire.
Yeah.
And so I've now referenced North Korea and Hitler too, so that's quite a company to put Putin in. So
good job. That's the daily double. Yeah. I'm thinking while you're saying that, MAGA, not MAGA, MAGA, make Russia great again. That's Putin, right?
Yeah.
But let's talk about the blowback Russia would face if it chose to break the decades-long taboo against using nuclear weapons. The White House already warned that there would be catastrophic consequences, while NATO's Secretary General said severe consequences. Former head of the CIA and retired General David Petraeus predicted that the U.S. and its NATO allies would destroy Russian troops and equipment in Ukraine and sink the entire Russian fleet in the Black Sea. And numerous diplomats have surely reminded their Russian counterparts that Moscow's use of nukes would immediately trigger the development of self-defensive nuclear programs in neighboring states like Turkey, Poland, and Finland, with the full backing of the U.S. and NATO, and that would not make Russia stronger or safer. As for how best to proceed, Biden might look to the history he cited of the Cuban Missile Crisis for answers. Michael Dobbs, writing in the New York Times, reminds us that even while President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev denounced each other publicly during the missile crisis, they maintained a back channel for direct communication. That back channel yielded a compromise, kept secret for decades, in which the U.S. agreed to dismantle its medium-range nukes in Turkey in exchange for a Soviet nuclear withdrawal from Cuba, exactly the type of off-ramp Biden seeks. It's a fool's errand to predict the future. Cold weather is coming to the Northern Hemisphere, and it's a lot harder for an invading army to seize territory when it's cold outside. Most observers think that Ukraine can make some military progress in the next 6 weeks before the roads are covered in mud, snow, and ice, whereupon the winter war of attrition will begin. With Russia bolstering its manpower as its conscripts reach the front, it's hard to imagine Putin retreating anytime soon. But there is an optimistic scenario for those who support Ukraine. As Elliot Cohen wrote in The Atlantic, quote, "Many wars end with one or more spectacular defeats that dramatically change moods and atmospheres, front lines and governments. The sooner the ultimate shock is delivered and Russian forces shattered and driven from occupied land, the quicker the suffering ends and the more swiftly the uncertain cloud of nuclear threats dissipates." End quote. Just as in Russia's war in Afghanistan or America's wars in Vietnam and Iraq, it eventually becomes obvious that it's not winnable, and the challenge instead becomes how to emerge from the loss with one's dignity, and one's government for that matter, still intact. If that isn't Putin's task already, it may soon be. So I guess my answer to your second question is that a Russia that's unable to conquer Ukraine is marginally less dangerous than one that is. But regimes like Putin's that invade their sovereign neighbors and don't think twice about committing war crimes like bombing and torturing civilians are dangerous regardless of whether their conventional forces are, as you put it, kind of a mess.
Yeah.
I have one last thought. It may seem glib to end a podcast about something as serious as whether the Russian military is a threat to world peace by quoting a song lyric. But there is a song lyric that I think is both relevant to this conversation and correct in its intuition. In the mid-1980s, during a Cold War that many thought had taken an ominous turn after the election of the anti-communist hardliner Ronald Reagan, Sting wrote a song called Russians that commented on the rhetorical speeches of both sides and ended with this line: "We share the same biology, regardless of ideology. What might save us, me and you, is if the Russians love their children too." At the end of the day, even former KGB agents turned corrupt dictators love their children. And therefore, I'm going to say that Putin's Russia does not pose an existential threat to humankind. I know that's small solace for the Ukrainians, but I hope it bolsters the determination of Western leaders not to give in to his threats and bluster. How's that for an answer?
Yeah, certainly giving in to threats and bluster. There's ample historical examples to attest that giving in to someone like Putin never resolves the problem. It just pushes it down the road. Neville Chamberlain giving in to Hitler on Poland did not shut down that threat. It just expanded it because Hitler was emboldened by that success. And the same would be true with Putin. If the world says, okay, go ahead, take Ukraine in exchange for world peace, then he's just going to think, okay, what former Soviet possession can I take next?
Yes. And to that very point, Mark, when he annexed Crimea 7 or 8 years ago, you could argue that exactly what you just said came true. He was emboldened because the world did basically nothing about it. And so this is part 2 of his land grab.
I'd also like to think that he is sensible enough in terms of nuclear devices on the battlefield to understand that if he's blowing up nukes in Ukraine, trade winds are going to blow those radioactive particles right back into Russia. So he would be basically irradiating his own country.
Yes. And on that point, let me just add, those same winds are going to blow the radiation into NATO countries, which NATO is going to take as an act of war against it. So he's going to find himself tangling with a superior force that's just going to wipe the floor with his country. So he must know this.
Yeah, though you wonder, because he should have known also that his conventional forces were in the state they were in with rusting guns and poor leadership and bad training. And yet the people around him, it seems, were telling him everything's awesome. We're terrific. We're the best in the world.
Yeah.
And maybe it was a similar case as we saw with the Trump administration, that anyone who told Trump no was out of a job shortly after that. And so by the end of his 4-year period, he was surrounded only by people who would say yes to him.
Yeah.
And it just was this downward spiral of narrow-minded incompetence that really brought us all to the brink. So maybe that's just, we're seeing the Russian version of that problem of someone who doesn't want to hear bad news, is not prepared for anything not going exactly according to plan. Because I
Yeah.
can't imagine, even if the Russian forces were thinking that Ukraine was going to be a pushover, I can't imagine that you would invade another country without a plan B, without considering what are we going to do if this doesn't work. Because who actually invades a country thinking, oh, this plan's going to be easy peasy? Like, if you're a professional military person, I can't imagine that that's something you do, which tells me there was a plan B, but no one was willing to take it up the chain because that's not what their leaders wanted to hear.
Yeah, I mean, you raise good questions, but I guess I'm thinking if you believe your own hype, then you might be capable of making a drastic mistake like that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I mentioned the same thing in my presentation about how the generals will tell him what he wants to hear. And maybe lie about the readiness of the Russian army, and he will ignore any advice he gets that doesn't correspond to what he wants to do. So that combination's pretty toxic. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily make him irrational. You know, at the end of the day, I think that Sting lyric really is true. Is he going to sacrifice the world for this? I don't think so. Thank God Joe Biden is president right now, because I think he's got the long view here, and the mentioning the Cuban Missile Crisis and the parallels I drew to the back channel and the off ramp is important. And I think Biden is smart enough and experienced enough to know that the best way out of this is to give Putin some kind of off ramp so he can save face while still not giving him success as he defines it, but give him a way to back out of this catastrophic mistake that doesn't imperil the world. And if anybody can figure out a way to do that, it's Joe Biden, which is why I say thank God he's the president right now.
Yeah. Well, if he were not the president right now, the president that we would have, the president who was on the Republican ticket, would probably have taken us out of NATO and might be supporting Russia in this. And instead of reading this morning about Russia using Iranian drones to target Ukrainian civilians, they might be using American drones to target Ukrainian civilians.
Yeah. And my son might be getting drafted. So,
yeah.
All right. Boy, what a downer of a topic, but definitely worth discussing.
Well, okay. So, well, your topic for us for next time, is it going to pull us out of the downers?
Not really. But this is a topic I think it's time for us to discuss. It's something that's been on my mind for a while, as you'll see from my question. So a few years ago, when my son was in high school, I was the parent representative on his school's safety committee. The safety committee typically concerns itself with things like petitioning the city to build a speed bump on the street outside the school, or whether to install metal detectors in the lobby. But much of our time was taken up, quite unexpectedly, with the vaping of e-cigarettes by students in the bathrooms, which had reached epidemic proportions by that time.
Yeah.
Around the same time, my wife and I caught our middle school-age daughter more than once with vaping paraphernalia in our apartment.
Mm.
You know, Mark, I've been an ardent non-smoker all my life.
Yes.
So you can imagine how thrilled I was to have this issue hit home the way it did. When I educated myself about it, I learned how the then market leader, Juul, and other purveyors of e-cigs were aggressively marketing them to kids despite stating the contrary in congressional hearings. As the FDA now wrestles with the question of whether to formally approve e-cigarettes as smoking cessation products, I put this question to you, Mark. Is there any redeeming value to vaping, or is it just another scam by the nicotine industrial complex to keep people hooked?
Okay. I will take a look at that. And it looks like that's it for this week's episode. If you have any questions about this episode or some comments, if you'd like to suggest a way to give Putin a face-saving way out of Ukraine, then please come by our Facebook page and post it to the thread underneath this episode.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah, who knows? We could maybe crowdsource a solution to this whole thing. If you would like other people to discover this podcast, there are certain ways you can help. You can, of course, tell your friends and family. about us, but you can also go to your podcast platform of choice, be that iTunes or Spotify or Google or Amazon or wherever it is that you get your podcasts, and give us a rating and a review. So do those things if it's in your heart. And if you don't do those things, we love you anyway. And that's it for this week. I'm Mark. That was Joe. And thank you for spending your time with us.
We'll talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.